Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to a Better Tech Economy webinar. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes as we wait for any arrivals. We'll wait for the room to fill. So feel free to hang out, grab a glass of water, grab your lunch, and we will get started shortly. And I'll keep repeating this message a couple of times as new folks are joining. Hello, those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the room to fill in. Repeat this message a couple more times, but yeah, like I said, we're just waiting for the room to fill in, some late arrivals, and I'll keep repeating the message one more time. We'll get started in a minute or two. Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Intro to Better Tech Economy webinar. I hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity. And so in my role, I get to engage with our supporters and our base through our organizing efforts. And now I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screens as we are going through the presentation, but we won't answer those until the end. I do want to say that the webinar is being recorded and will be sent out afterwards via email, along with a copy of the slides and relevant links. In case you want to rewatch it or share it with a friend, you'll have access to all that later this afternoon. What are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to talk about some of these community tensions with tech. We'll talk about bad policy choices that have predated tech's arrival. We'll talk about how tech equity fits in to combat some of these issues. And we'll talk about solutions we've identified that you can help support to ensure that our tech economy works for everyone. So let's start off with talking about some of the tensions we've seen with tech. We know that communities are frustrated with tech, and it really comes to no surprise. We see that when tech is shouldering the blame, it starts to create this us versus them dynamic that's further dividing the community. And I know for myself personally, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've been able to witness this firsthand. I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities, what that means for themselves, for their jobs, for their homes, but also friends and family who pursued jobs within the tech industry and found lots of success. And unfortunately, as the tech sector continues to expand, especially accelerated by remote work into other cities across the country, we've seen that many of these inequities experienced in the Bay Area begin to replicate elsewhere. So how did we get here? Well, we know that tech did not start the level of pain our communities have been facing for years. The inequities have been in our economy and society for decades, even when Silicon Valley was still farmland. And all of these feelings of frustration are understandable, like we just talked about. And there really isn't no doubt that tech has exacerbated inequality, but tech didn't necessarily start these issues. And over the last couple of decades, there's been this overall shift in the balance of power that has hindered our community's ability to prosper and to survive. And so let's talk about what we've seen historically. And the shift of power that we just talked about, it has benefited corporations. While the government was cutting back on social programs, they were simultaneously cutting taxes for large corporations in the 80s. So individual tax rates have been following the same trajectory. That's the blue line on the graph on the screen. But we see that corporate taxes have been on a steady decline. That's that gold yellowish line at the bottom. And just to put that in perspective, in 2019, a couple of years ago, 49% of our tax revenue, around $626 billion, was collected from individuals versus 5%, $59 billion coming from corporations. And these tax cuts and increase in profits for companies has come at the expense of workers and their voice. And we know that corporations have a long history of suppressing worker power and worker voice. And there are numerous accounts of union busting, strategic attacks on worker-centered organizations that have only reinforced this profit over people approach. And a combination of all this has led to a shift in power that's still disproportionately impacting people in our economy today. And corporations have begun to flex this shift in power by entering communities and buying up apartments and homes in an effort to maximize profits. And we're seeing corporations' bad practices as new landlords through inaccurate background checks, predatory ownership schemes, and exclusionary lending. And they've begun to reinforce the racist and exclusionary housing practices of the past, also known as redlining. And you may be asking yourselves, what is redlining? Well, in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area and California and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. Redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And the policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed the riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined, as we can see with the image of the screen, is a map of Seattle. And those communities that were deemed risky investments or redline didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color. And that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory policy and a racist policy, and it made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. And there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often the communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. And on top of some of these exclusionary zoning policies, it's simply just too expensive to build affordable homes in our country today. If we take a look at San Francisco, for example, it costs about $1.2 million to build one unit of housing. And even if more housing does get built, tenants are not protected enough to be able to remain in their homes. And we've seen that eviction rates and displacement rates have continued to increase heavily over the years, and families have been pushed into the outer edges of major cities, further away from job centers and resources. And in New York, weakened tenant laws have drastically led to a decrease in homes available for people. And evictions are not just happening in expensive areas like San Francisco and New York, but are also in up and coming tech cities like Atlanta. And eviction rates across the country are continuing to push our most vulnerable community members away. And on top of tenants having little to no power in order to combat these evictions, they also lack power in their jobs. And as we can see here, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. And according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers that's covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. And this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And not having this ability to speak up and address worker injustices has led to constant disturbing stories about worker conditions. And we're hearing about disturbing workplace practices that are putting workers at risk both physically and mentally. And a lot of the times, the workers that are the most impacted are contract workers and people performing ghost work. So ghost work is a term used to describe the kind of work that feels like it's automated, but in reality, it has a person behind the scenes performing these tasks. So a couple of examples are like content moderation. And in our research on contract workers in tech, we found that contract workers receive fewer benefits and are paid less than tech employees while doing the same work as their directly employed counterparts. And these workers are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian women, and non-binary people. And it's a little out of context that the tech industry came to power and cemented itself as the engine of our current economy. The tech industries positioned as arguably the most powerful sector of American business, requires that they do take some responsibility for how the economy has grown and is growing. And in addition, tech should employ some business practices or create products that directly impact the economic health of our communities. If we look at the top companies in our economy today, tech does own a lot of the market share. We have a couple of familiar faces on there: Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon. And like we talked about, tech didn't create social and economic inequity in the US, but it has had a role in worsening that inequity, and it does have responsibility to help fix it. For us at TechEquity Collaborative, our community of tech workers, activists, community members, and advocates have the civic power to help rebalance this power within and outside of the tech industry. And we identify and uncover overlooked issues of inequity so that you can champion for some of those solutions. So, how does tech equity work? Well, our goal is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. And we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. And we help our community approach these big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. So, our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live through book club discussions, panel discussions, webinars such as the one you're on, and voter guides along election season. And we also advocate for public policy that's rebalancing power and building economic equity. And a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we worked alongside other coalition members and state legislators to help extend protections to 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. We also had the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act, SB 1162, that around increasing pay transparency and requiring more equitable hiring practices. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community through our corporate partnerships and engagements. So, what issues are we seeing within tech and as a result of tech that we can address? Well, within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse, and contracted workers. And temporary, contract, and contingent workers who are hired through these contracting agencies are often doing the same work as their directly employed peers while making less money, receiving fewer benefits, and experiencing career immobility. So at TechEquity, we've done research known as the Contract Worker Disparity Project to help them cover some of these issues. And at the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And we've worked on the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act, SB 1162, like I was mentioning earlier, to address some of these inequities within the tech industry. But there's also inequities as a result of tech that we've been working on. Tech has produced a lot of wealth, but that wealth has exacerbated our communities, and people have been displaced, homes have become more expensive. And however, we can repurpose some of this wealth to strengthen tenant protections, produce more affordable housing, and help communities organize around policies that are changing the ownership structure back into the hands of the people instead of corporations. And we've tackled these issues through our work on Prop 13 reform. And next up, we have the impact of tech products. Prop tech is accelerating the corporate takeover of single-family starter homes and renting at a mass scale. And these new companies are venture-backed and digitally enabled, and they play an increasingly influential role in the economy, from new modes of housing construction to automated home buying. These tech-enabled companies are promising to scale to massive market share and reap higher valuations along the way. So we have to be thoughtful about how we can work with companies to not reinforce biases in their products. And we're working on this already through our Tech Bias in Housing initiative. And we're also building tools, visualizations, and apps that are supporting the movement for economic justice. So you can actually join our team of volunteer researchers, designers, coders, and data analysts to collaborate on tough problems and share your skills. So for example, we had volunteers in the past help us build out a website that would help renters calculate whether or not their landlord's rent increase was illegal or legal and how to access resources based off of that. So this year, the key initiatives really began with the Contract Worker Disparity Project. As I mentioned, it's a first of its kind worker-centered initiative that shedding the light on the practice of contracting out and proposes and advocates for public policy solutions and partners with companies to adopt responsible contracting practices. We also have the Tech Bias in Housing Initiative, examining the promises and perils of housing technology. So we aim to ensure that the technological innovations in the housing space do not reinforce the racist housing systems and policies of the past. And finally, we have the Housing Data Initiative. So passing good policies, it's meaningless if those policies aren't implemented well. And together with our coalition partners and government officials, we identify where tech can be a lever for smart policy implementation, and we enlist tech workers to build the tools that move us from talk to action. So what can you do today? Well, you can sign up to become a civic tech volunteer and flex your skills. You can tell your friends about us. You can contribute to the organization, or you can join me for a one-on-one conversation. I do offer one-off conversations via Zoom where we're able to talk about a little more in depth about tech equity, what we offer, and how you can get plugged into our work directly with me. And you can also check us out at our next event. We have tons of events throughout the year. I'll be sending out a link to upcoming events, and you can also find previous event recordings on there as well. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. So I'm just going to take a minute to see if anyone has any questions. Please drop them into the Q&A if you haven't. It's okay if you don't. If you think of something later, like I said, respond back to that email and I can get back to you. I'll just take a couple seconds to see if anyone has anything. Cool. Not seeing anything. Totally fine. I want to thank you all so much for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join our movement. Keep an eye out for that email. And if something does come up, if you have a question, if you are looking for a specific link or opportunity, just reach out to me and I'll try to point you in the right direction. Thank you, everyone.